Hello, everyone. My name's Kapil, and I'm presenting my Winter 2019 work on my project, Mixed Initiative Orchestration Technologies. So to start, there are many different ways that we currently work. So for example, we have work settings where we work individually, settings where we're mentored by others, settings where there's a very strong hierarchy in how people interact with one another, and settings where we have distributed communities that certain individuals manage certain sets of tasks and then others contribute to those tasks. So for example, an individual work scenario could be something like a freelancer working on a project for a client. A mentorship scenario or an apprenticeship scenario could be one where you're working with a graduate research advisor and learning how to do graduate research. Hierarchical structures are found in many work organizations today. And an example of distributed communities would be Wikipedia, where you have article owners, but then you have a bunch of other people helping to edit and to maintain that article. And the core difference between these is that there's a difference in the agency that people get to make project level decisions and the actual process of how work is accomplished. So in a slightly different model, what if instead there was actually a combination of some of these ideas? So if you wanted to have a community where you have distributed control over different projects and different pieces of the work, you could imagine a scenario where you have a community where there's a single community head who runs the community in general direction and guidance of the community, but then there's a hierarchical structure so that there's apprentices of the community head who actually runs individual subgroups where people in the community are doing different kinds of work or driving some of their own work. So in this case, each person gets to do their own individual tasks, but they're still part of this larger community collective that's working towards some collective goal. And an example of this is in research training, there's a model called the Agile Research Studio model. It's a model that emphasizes this distributed learning model so that you can have teams of people, so groups of SIGs is what it's called in ARS, who each work on like similar projects, but each student in the project is doing their own. Each student in the SIG is doing their own project. And so what's interesting about this is you get a community of 20 to 30 people where each person is working on their own project, but there's these supports where they can get feedback from the people in their group, people from the community as a whole, and many different social structures and tools that allow them to get this feedback. And the end goal is that it allows one faculty member and a handful of PhD students to train 20 to 30 undergrads in conducting independent and self-directed research. So why might it be interesting to study a community like this? Well, looking at some prior work in work organizations and learning communities, Marx et al. Looked at how different teams do tasks over time. And they created this model where you have these like actions and transition states for each task, where during transition phases you might be doing things like analyzing the goals that you have, forming a strategy, and then near the action phase you're actually doing some work or doing some coordination to actually get the work done. But this is quite limited because it's really only showing what's happening for one task overall, and it's not actually talking about how different pieces of the community are being used. Dillenberg gets a little bit closer to that by showing how in a classroom setting, you can have things that are done by the individual. So for example, doing readings before class, but then also things that teams of students will do in the class, and then the class as a whole is doing. But here what's different is that everyone in the classroom setting is working on the same task. And so what's curious is what happens when you have a community like you do in an ARS, where people are working on different projects and are at different states in their projects at any given time. And so this leads to some really interesting research questions about the ARS structure and communities that use the ARS model. So the first being like, how do generally mentors and students use the various processes and tools to orchestrate their research and learning goals? The second is because there are so many different moving parts, what breakdowns or challenges might students face during this orchestration process? And finally, given some of these challenges and breakdowns, how could we build new tools and technologies for distributed communities of practice and work that solve some of these practical orchestration challenges? And so what we did was we did a quarter-long study of one ARS, the Design Technology and Research Program at Northwestern University. It was primarily an interview study where we interviewed one faculty mentor, 4 PhD student mentors, and 5 of the students in that research community. We did 2 rounds of interviews. So the first round was only for the mentors, where we tried to understand what successes and failures mentors had when mentoring students. In the second round, we focused more on understanding generally what community values mentors and students care about, the actions that are taken towards meeting those values, and what struggles arise from when they do those actions. An important thing to note is that the interview guides used for round 2 were built off of some of the core themes found in round 1. So for example, one of the core themes was emphasizing good use of resources and time. And so in round 2, we asked directly about what actions people take when they're doing help seeking and how do they identify when to help seek and things like that. These interviews are typically about an hour long. Some may have run over to about an hour and a half at most. We additionally conducted observations at special interest group or SIG meetings for each SIG. So we had a total of 8 observations over 1 academic quarter. And each of these SIG meetings were an hour long. For data collection, interviews were audio recorded and then interview transcripts were generated from the recording. And during field observations, jottings were taken and field notes were generated from those jottings. For analysis, we take a thematic analysis-like approach. So we do open coding on both the transcripts and the field notes to generate some ideas for common themes that we're seeing. And then we do axial coding on those open codes to actually begin to relate individual themes together to one another to form more concrete themes. In addition, we take some inspiration from Dillenbrow's orchestration graphs to create timelines from some of the stories that were generated in the first round of interviews mentors to get a good sense of like what the sequence of events were, all the actions that were taken, and then especially the intent behind why certain actions were taken or certain actions were recommended to a student. So to go into core findings, so to start, generally what do students and mentors value in DTR and why? And so there were generally 3 things that were surfaced in our interviews. The first was that getting help when stuck. And so from the mentor's perspective, mentors know that they're limited on time and they can't help every student. So they feel that it's better for students to be able to reach out and get help when they're stuck so they can continue the progress. And for students, one of the ideas was that if they could get help from someone who knows their issue and they know they can solve their issue in a minute, they'd rather have that than working on some issue for an hour and trying to get it done. Another theme was that both mentors and students focused on or wanted to prioritize working on the riskiest risks in a project. For the mentor, that meant that they wanted their students to work towards the most new understanding they possibly could have for their projects. And similarly, students also wanted to build the most knowledge towards their project, especially because of the limited time that they have as a student in DTR. And finally, the last common theme was the idea of self-direction. And this is related to both help-seeking and riskiest risks, but one thing that's interesting is that the reasons for them are a little bit different. So for self-direction, the mentors explicitly said that they cared about how a student can grow independent of the mentor so they can guide and plan their own projects. And the implications of that, both if the student were to go on later to be a graduate student or also even in the workplace. And for students, it was more about the satisfaction and the fulfillment of being able to lead and realize a research project from start to finish, which is something that several students mentioned that they can't ever do in other classes. So moving on to what is actually orchestration in DTR. So there were 2 big themes about how DTR is orchestrated. The first is around emphasizing the effective use of scarce community resources. So there are many resources in DTR. A lot of the human resources are quite scarce because the community helps themselves, and the community is um, doing all the work on its own. So these resources get used quickly. And one that's incredibly important is the status update. So one emphasis by mentors was that when you have these really critical resources where you can gain a lot of feedback, but you're using the whole community's time in order to do that, such as a status update, you wanted to meet and discuss to prepare for the status update as best you can beforehand. Um, but even generally, like even for just simple day-to-day meetings, mentors emphasize that students should try to use the meeting time most effectively by bringing in things to the meeting that they want to talk about and having a plan for what they want to use the meeting for. Um, and finally, a common theme that arose around um, using resources efficiently was to push requests that mentors got to other people. So, for instance, if a student needed help with filling out the sprint log, not necessarily planning, but just using the tool, mentors found that it actually wasn't a good use of their time to help with the student, and instead the students should go ask someone else in GTR who knows how to use the tools and can help them work through their problems. That way that the mentors can focus on actually the problems that are more critical to them, more critical to the research path. On the other hand, there are also effective work practices. So generally working towards the riskiest risks of your project. So during each SIG, students would present what their risks were for the project, and they would get feedback from their mentors and other SIG mates about what might be more important or less important. And there are also two different goals towards planning. So the first would be near time planning in SIG. So students would take their risks and have a plan of work for the next 2 weeks for their sprint plan on how they plan to address their risks. And they would get feedback on whether certain tasks were right or wrong, or if they had too many tasks, how they might slice down so that they can do the work and deliver something useful by the end of the sprint, but in the limited time that they have. And finally, there's this notion of a longer term project and deliverable planning. So a common theme was that mentors would often sit down with students and help them plan what they wanted to get done by the end of the quarter, so that they could figure out with the student like what actually what the student would need to do to reach their goals, and also what challenges might arise. So for example, one mentor mentioned how they talked through a student's testing plan and said that, well, you basically have a limited time to test because you can only test once a week because of the nature of their project. And so how they use the limited testing opportunities effectively in order to get a good results by the end of the quarter. And so an example of the status update that I first talked about, we generated this timeline that shows all the different actions taken in order to orchestrate a status update. So for example, at Studio, it's made aware that a student is doing a status update, and then the student then meets with their faculty advisor or also their SIG head to figure out what they might try to do. And then this is used to help draft a plan, which then gets feedback from the SIG head and also the mentor so that they have some good notion of what they'll actually do in status update and know that their status update will be relatively effective. So moving on now to tensions. There were two tensions that arose. First is that identifying resources that can help you or your student is hard. So specifically, mentors struggle to know what resources are available at any given time because they don't have much visibility into what others are currently doing. That makes it challenging because mentors may sometimes worry that they're recommending a resource that is already overused, or that resource may simply not be available because the student is too busy. On the other hand, students struggle to ask for help beyond their SIG or a core group of people that they might know or are friends with because they're unsure of the expertise of others and are also afraid to waste others' time because they know that everyone is busy. This is especially common with older DTR students who are unsure about what new students offer and what new students could help them with. And so their traditional or their fallback help-seeking strategy is to just go to some of the more senior students that they know very well instead of trying to reach out to others. Another tension that was found was that there's often a misalignment between the expectations or understanding that a mentor or a student may have. Um, in one way, this manifests itself so mentors don't really have an awareness into what students are doing week to week between SIG and Studio, which can cause students to work on things that aren't actually the most important aspects of their project. And they can't get checked until the mentor sees them during SIG or Studio and asks them what they actually did during that week. And so this can lead to some wasted work or potentially work towards something that isn't actually important for a project at the time. For students, a struggle that students mention is that they often struggle to integrate the feedback the mentors have back into their plan, which results in deliverables that may not match the expectation of the mentors. And this is challenging because students mentioned how maybe in the moment they don't totally understand why the feedback is being given, or why mentors think that the students should do something else instead of what they're currently doing. Yeah. And so one example of this misalignment between expectations is there's an example here of how a student team talked early on in the quarter about how they might try to write a paper for a conference that was due basically at the end of the quarter. And even though they talked the idea about it, and they talked about concrete deliverables that they could start doing to figure out the conceptual contribution and what the contribution of the papers might be, what actually happened was that the student team reactively started building tech and planning out a study and running a study. And the mentor and the faculty mentor were unaware that this was actually happening until one of the other graduate students mentioned that they were being recruited for the study. And so because of that, they actually didn't talk about it until SIG. And what was even riskier was that the SIG that the students had was the day of a status update that the students were doing. And because of this new focus on wanting to run a study, the SIG head was actually unsure now if the plans that they originally talked about with their student team about what they would do for a status update were actually the same things that the team planned to do. And so now there's a lot of uncertainty in the status update and whether or not they would now use a status update resource effectively. So this example is nice because it shows how some of the effects of actions that students may have because of misalignment could also have other downstream effects that prevent other work practices from being done effectively, like the status update example we saw earlier. And so what does all this mean for the technology and the tools we might want to build? So first, in order to help understand like what resources are available and what people could do to help each other, we might want to build technologies that help support the awareness of the studio. So for example, show what things that other students are working on, promote some like level of global awareness of what students are available or what things they're helping with, and then potentially even build interfaces for coordinating help. So given that you have certain people who can help with certain things, and you have all these needs that are surfacing, how could you help actually coordinate interactions across the community so you're getting many people to help, even people that a student may not necessarily have known to reach out to originally. And an example of what an interface like this could do is shown on the right. Another potential technology is tools for helping check a line between mentors and students. So what these tools might do is show the takeaways and interpretations of how a student might revise a plan or deliverable, and then allow them to get feedback from the mentor if there is a misunderstanding in what they heard at SIG or what they thought they heard at SIG or any other meeting. And so to close, the takeaways from what I learned this quarter, generally for the values of DTR, there's an importance and an emphasis on help seeking, working towards your res, and being able to self-direct your research. For orchestration DTR, two big areas of orchestration rely on or emphasize the use of scarce resources and effective work practices. And then two, these orchestration goals, there's also struggles with how actually you identify the resource, and then misalignment and expectation between students and mentors that can arise when you're trying to do some of these work practices where students try to work towards their riskiest risks. And the design implications for those then become wanting to build tools that help support awareness of the full studio, and also technologies that help promote alignment on takeaways and deliverables between mentors and students.